mining all his life. The U.S. Census of 1890 was lost to a fire in 1921, but the U.S. Census of 1900, 1910, and 1920 show him still in Idaho and still a lead miner. Gottfried never married. Gottfried never bought or owned a house. I do not believe that Gottfried lost his testimony of the restored gospel he received in his youth. I'm still looking for any footprints that might have been left by him in early church records, but in those areas he was living and working, there were few opportunities for membership in organized record-keeping branches. In her book, This Quiet Ground, by Julia I. Randolph, there is a notation that says, Kunz, John. John died at the Salmon Hot Springs. He had lived at Nikolai, and he was 79 years old when he died. Idaho Recorder, December 5th, 1928. End quote. John was really 75 years old. How would they have known? There was an old folks' home at the Hot Springs Ranch where the county helped out indigent residents. There is a county section in the Salmon City Cemetery with many unmarked graves where the indigent individuals were placed. As John does not appear on any of the city cemetery plats and there is no marker, it is believed he was buried in that county section. About November 20th of 1928, he was being treated for influenza by Dr. J. Martin of Salmon, Idaho. After about 7 days, he caught bronchial pneumonia and died on the 1st of December, 1928. According to his death certificate, he was buried in the Salmon City Cemetery on December 2nd, 1928. There was no autopsy done, and Mr. William C. Dobler, the undertaker, had to guess on much of the information as he filled out a death certificate because he didn't know Gottfried. During the summer of 2011, there was a memorial placed in the Bern Cemetery for Johann Gottfried Kunz because he was part of the original founding family of Bern and he contributed to the family's well-being. Uncle G.J. himself is still in an unknown location in the Lemhi County section of the Salmon City Cemetery in Idaho. But for those that still visit Bern and the Bern Cemetery with a heart that has been turned toward their fathers, there is a granite reminder of their Uncle Johann Gottfried Kunz. Hopefully this will help him reestablish his place in the founding family of Bern. David Kunz, the fifth son and seventh child of John II and Rosina Canuti, was born the 30th of October 1855 in Demtingen, Bern, Switzerland. He immigrated with John II and Rosina when they brought their family to Utah in the summer of 1870. David was 15 years old at that time. David spent the first fall and winter with his family in Logan. Robert recorded that while they were in Logan, the older boys got work on the threshing jobs, but had to take wheat for their pay. 3 younger boys gleaned in the fields, getting about a sack of wheat heads each per day. They would then take the sack of heads to the thresher, have it threshed, and take the wheat to the mill and get it ground into flour. During the time the family lived in this little house in Logan, Robert said we got about 1 quart of milk for all of us that winter each day. We had to walk 8 blocks to pick up the milk, which was about a 2-mile round trip. It was David's job to get it most of the time. David was one of the sons that went with Mr. Herzog to get logs out in the fall of 1870 and stack them in Ovid. Then in the spring of 1871, David was one of the boys named in Robert's history that helped Herbert Horsley and J.U. Stuckey and his father and Samuel put up the cabin. David was now 16. David was working with his father making cheese at Ovid when Bishop Edlefson suggested that the family move to Bern, and he sold the squatter's rights to the whole of Bern for $50. except for the land north of Henry's Place, because Apostle Charles C. Rich held those squatters' rights, and the whole of Bern was all the land south of the North Street in Bern. Some of the histories record that David put up the money. They now had land that they could homestead on, and John II started making preparations to build the first home in Bern proper, a home for he and Rosina and their family still at home. John II named Bern, Idaho, after Bern, Switzerland. In 1876, when the family had been in Bern for a year, and John II had hired Ephraim Jones to be the first school teacher in Bern, the student list included Jacob and William, Robert, Catherine, David. David was now 21 years old. This was a privately financed school, and the majority of the students were all John and Rosina's children. David was still working with his father in the dairy at this time, and they were milking many rented cows which they pastured in Bern and the surrounding area, as at this time it was all still unfenced open range. The younger boys, Jacob, William, and Robert, spent their summer days herding cows morning until night. David held 2 locations in Bern proper with springs, where he eventually built homes, one just below the peak and the other about a quarter-mile north. He first built a house on his north lot during the summer of 1878, where there was abundant water from a spring, where he and Louisa Jacobs started their family prior to his serving his mission. After his mission and his marriage to Sophia Nielsen, he built a second home at the base of the peak, where their youngest son, Reed, lived all of his adult life and raised his family, where Alan, his grandson, still lives. There was a good spring on that lot. Today that spring still feeds 2 homes, and this is looking at the overflow coming out of that spring. And that overflow runs down a ditch for livestock water. This is where the ditch went. It run right down almost directly east, right over through those trees, and went down toward John Kunz II, his original home, and down to the original dairy that he built in Bern. The original dairy was right at the base, right in those trees right down there. Right there, there's 2 homes. There's one that we're blocking the view of the other. The one that's blocked out is John Kunz II's original home, and that's where they fed water to with wood pipes that they augered out green poles. And I'm going to show you how they did that based on what I can find in the history and based on what Grandpa, that's Parley Kunz, told me firsthand, because he participated in making those pipes. That right through there is where the original dairy was. This is livestock water down in the corrals that belonged to David originally. This is overflow from the spring coming down and being captured for livestock water. This is one of the original outbuildings that David Kunz built. And the reason that I'm here is because this is the kind of a place they would have made that wood pipe, and I'm going to show you how Grandpa explained to me that that was done. They had a straight pole like the piece you're looking at, and he explained to me in detail that they had some clamps that would hold the pole up and that would clamp the pole solid while they augered the hole in it. And so I'm going to set the camera up, and I'm going to show you how that was done. You can see how the log was clamped in, and this the weight of the log and the spread of the legs clamped the log in and held it tight, and as long as they had something solid to push against, they could auger without any trouble. Now I've leaned the auger up against the pole over there so that you can take a look at it a little closer. You can see how that has a scoop on the end plus a drill cutter on the end of it so that it'll go in and cut and gather the shavings so it'll bring the shavings out. It was about 6 feet long. Parley told me that they did about 6 foot lengths of pipe so that they could stay straight in them. Now I'm going to show you how this was done. See the log is locked into the bracing, into the clamps. The end of it's against the building, to which is solid. And then we take the auger and put it in the pipe and turn it. You can hear that cutting as it's going through the wood. It's a slow process. After you load it up with shavings, you've cut a load of shavings, then you bring it out and you dump the shavings out. You can see how that works. And they would bevel the ends. They had another tool with a piece of round stock with a knife embedded in it that was clamped, and they would go ahead and put a bevel on the inside of the pipe. With that tool you can see the bevel so that they could fit them together. Okay, now you can see on the other end of the pipe, when they finished drilling the hole through, they would put a bevel on the other end so that they had a bevel and a taper that would interlock to give them the maximum water flow with the least amount of leakage. This would have been kind of what their lash up would have looked like according to what my grandfather Kunz, or Parley, explained to me the day that I went out to the dairies. And this is the way that they took water from this spring right here at the base of the peak, from David's second home down to his dad John Kunz II's home and down to the dairies. They also used this method at getting water into the dairies out at Williamsburg. William J. talks a lot in his history about making wood water pipes and installing them, and David used what water he needed for his home, and some of the water was piped down the hill in wood pipes that were made by augering out the centers of green poles that were fitted together for piping water to the dairy and for Father John II. The excess water ran down the hill in an open stream, being used by all for the watering of livestock. There was a verbal water agreement made at that time that is honored today by his grandson, even though the lots below have changed from the Kunz family. On the 10th of October, 1878, at age 23, David married Louisa Marie Jacob. Their first child, David J. Kunz, was born the 1st of May, 1880, in Bern. Their second son was born the 22nd of July, 1881, in Bern. He died the 10th of May, 1882. It was about the year of 1882 that the Kunz Dairy changed from the making of Swiss cheese to making American cheese, as the curing time was significantly less. Robert tells us in his history that David was still helping his father operate an extensive American cheese factory as of the summer of 1882. Robert continues, Father and Dave moved to the island to their hay to make feeding of the cattle for the winter easier. Remember, David was 27, married, and had one child, had lost one son, and Louisa Marie was pregnant with their third child, a daughter, Lula Rosina, who was born March 14, 1883 at Bern. This was March in Bern. This was winter in Bern. Most likely she was born at Grandma Rosina's home in Bern, even though David and Aunt Lou had a home, because Aunt Lou would have needed some help and care. It sounds like David and John, his father, moved to the island where the hay was to feed cattle for the winter, wherever that was. Sometime after the spring of 1883 and to the fall of 1884, David had entered into an agreement with President John Taylor to run a ranch with a large herd of cattle on shares for him. Again, Robert tells us that when David received his mission call in October of 1884, with only 2 weeks for departure, it was then necessary to have Will take over a big herd of cattle and a ranch which David had on shares, which from President John Taylor, so David could go serve. From Robert Schmidt's journal and from William and Mary Ann's history, we know the Taylor Ranch was east of Paris and north of Bear Lake, down in the meadows, as William and Mary Ann's first child, a stillborn daughter, was born there. Robert tells us also that in order for Will to be able to do this for his brother David, Robert had to give up his homestead in Thomas Fork, that's Raymond, which he had just filed on that year, and disposed of 2 loads of house logs and 1 load of lumber for his intended house on that homestead by giving them to his father-in-law, Johannes Eschler, who had the filing next to his. Robert, who had less invested than Will, moved to Wardboro to run Will's farm, so Will wouldn't lose his investment and homestead. David still had a home and family in Bern. David still held lots in Bern proper. David was still spending time with his involvement in the Kunz Dairy in Bern, as he had hired Annie Schmid, William J.'s future wife, early in 1884 to work for him in Bern. I find nothing to indicate his resolution of that interest in